liturgical year that almost invites us to reflect on a topic like grief. When we think about the traditional ways of conceiving this season, and we think about what's traditionally called asceticism or self-denial or various forms of self-discipline, and sometimes during the Lenten season we will symbolically give up things that we love in order to reflect upon our own mortality and to think about the struggles that we face in life, to sort of imitate Jesus in the desert who went 40 days without eating. So then we do in our own small ways, we give up eating chocolate, or we stop drinking coffee, or we do something that is sacrificial without really being sacrificial. It's sort of the small s sacrificial without the big S sacrificial. And grief is one of those things that kind of comes into our lives on its own schedule. When you plan out your year on January 1st, and you think about all the things that you want to accomplish in 2017, and you start making a list, and you start thinking about the birthdays you want to celebrate, and you think about the vacation that you might want to take in the summer, one of the things that we can never pencil in are these seasons of loss and these seasons of grief that intrude and impede and erupt and disrupt our lives. There's sort of this popular misconception of people of faith that if you believe in God or you believe in Jesus and you go to church and you do all the right things, then bad things will never happen to you and everything will be okay. I remember when my dad had a heart attack when he was 52 or something like that, and one of my uncles, who was not a church-going person, was just so confused. I don't understand why this would happen to Sam, my dad. I don't understand why this would happen to Sam. He's such a good person. As if somehow being a good person would keep you from having a heart attack. But there's this popular level conception that somehow faith is some kind of blanket of security. I see you we're nothing a blanket. It's a blanket of security. It's like something, it's a wall that we build around us. It's a fortress. It's something that keeps us safe from all the uncertainties of life. And then we're constantly dealing with crises of faith, crises of that popular faith, when life turns out different than that. And when we have to struggle with things like loss and things like grief. Fortunately, grief is a central part of what Scripture talks about, and loss is a central part of what Scripture talks about. And these kind of eruptions and disruptions of our lives are not something foreign to the testimony of the Bible at all, and certainly not something that was foreign to the life of Jesus. And so for us to talk about a topic like grief in the season of Lent is not only seasonally appropriate, but it's also appropriate to our faith. And as I said last week, and I continually go back every week and try to review what we talked about the week before, we do this because it's a necessary topic in order to prepare us for those times when loss is inevitably going to come. And the longer we live, the more we will accumulate loss. Everything that we love, we will eventually lose, says Terry Tempest Williams. What a poignant thought. Everything that we love, we will eventually lose. And Mary Oliver, who said in that poem that I quoted a few weeks ago, the three things you must know in life. You must love what is mortal. You must hold it to your bones, knowing that your life depends on it. And when the time comes, you must let it go. You must let it go. These realities of loving and holding and letting go. So I want to talk about grief today in terms of the process of grief, in terms of how do we become a community that gets good at grief? How do we become people who get good at this thing that we all will have to do? How do we sort of do preventive preparation, not preventive maintenance, because we can't protect ourselves from it, but how do we begin to think about grief and think about loss in such a way as a community so that when it inevitably happens to us in our lives, we're all prepared to sort of be faithful people with each other. Faithful to God and faithful to each other and faithful to the experience of loss and the experience of grief. And as we talked last week, there's a way in which grief can actually be the cement that sort of brings a community together. That wonderful passage in the Apostle Paul's letter to the Corinthians, where he says that we comfort others with the comfort which we have ourselves received from God. And so there's this wonderful kind of ecology of comfort that happens as God comforts us in our grief, and then we comfort someone else, and it becomes this community in which comfort in the midst of these losses, in the midst of these grieving situations, becomes a normal part of what we do. Where else in our lives are we going to go? Where else in our lives are we going to look for people to be with in times of grief other than our faith community? This is something that we need to be good at. It's something that needs to be important to us. Of all the things that we might be called to do as followers of Jesus in this world, one of the most important things that we can do is to be a community that knows how to practice good grief. So we want to think about that today. I want to draw your attention to Psalm 137. It's been interesting to think about scriptures in relationship to this topic, because oftentimes not only the lectionary, but in terms of my own kind of scriptural memory, has sort of been honed to passages about faith and about hope and about love, and they haven't been drawn to these passages in which people in the Bible experience loss and are expressing grief. And so I really had to sort of dig into my scriptural study to try to find passages that would be useful to talk about and helpful to talk about in this context. And I want to draw your attention to Psalm 137 today, which is such an interesting psalm, both in its beginning and also in its end. This is a psalm that comes out of the time of exile in Babylon. So this is not a Davidic psalm. This was written by someone much later than David. And these familiar words: "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land?" So that's the first question. How can we sing the songs of the Lord when we're in the foreign land of loss? It's easy to sing the Lord's songs when you're feeling joyful. It's easy to sing "Up from the grave he arose on Easter morning." It's easy to be happy when the bills are paid and the job is going to continue for another year and the family is doing well and the sun is shining. It's easy to sing the songs of the Lord. But how do we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? A land that we don't want to be in. A land that in some ways we've been taken captive and pulled into exile, which is almost the most perfect description of what a season of loss and a season of grief can be like. It's almost like an invader has come into your lives through some announcement of cancer or heart disease or loss of a job or a spouse running away or children getting in certain kinds of trouble. It's like some invader has come into your life, and the things that you were focused on each and every day and kind of going along with your life so peacefully and well, all of a sudden this invader has come in and has taken you captive and hauled you off to a foreign land. And so the question of the psalmist becomes very, very relevant to us. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Do you remember that American Pie album by Don McLean? Some of you are as old as me. Do you remember that one? Remember the album when he had his thumb on the cover with the American flag? I had that album. I still remember that cover. And he had a beautiful song, besides the American Pie song, which is actually a song about grief, if you really analyze it. It's him grieving the loss of his childhood and the demise of classic rock and roll music. But there's another song in there that's about real things. And it's based upon this verse in Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept. He sings it as a round, and I don't think it's original to him. I think it's probably a traditional tune. But I listened to it again yesterday for the first time in many, many decades, maybe. And it's a very simple kind of banjo melody. And he sings, by the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion. So I've been singing this song over and over in the last couple days. We're called to get down by the waters and to sing these songs in a foreign land. This is the process that grief calls us into. So there's two parts to this in the way that grief sort of needs to be dealt with. And again, we're talking about the experience of loss, and we're talking about how the process of grief helps us compost loss into the kind of soil out of which good things can grow. So that, as Julia Cosdorf says in that line, as we gather losses, we may also grow in love. That's what we want to do. We want to grow in love, despite the fact that we've experienced some terrific eruption, despite the fact that we've been taken captive by Babylonians and hauled off to a foreign land. We somehow want that experience to produce the soil out of which good things can continue to grow. That's what Wendell Berry calls practicing resurrection even out of the most difficult of circumstances. So the first part of good grief is this process of sort of containment. We have to somehow, when we're experiencing grief, we have to find a container for it. And containers can look different. But one of the crucial things about containers is that we can't be a container for ourselves. You can't contain your own grief. How can I explain this? Well, in all the traditional kinds of practices that communities have evolved over the centuries for how to help people get through grief, they're almost always communal processes. They're almost always involve the community gathering around. I mean, we still do this to a large extent when we have memorial services and funerals and wakes. Different traditions express it in different ways and with different levels of detail, but there's this understanding that grief is this thing that requires a container, and that container is constructed by your friends, your relatives, those who love you, those who care for you. They gather around you. And you are in the center of this container with your hurt and with your open woundedness. You provide this container for others, and they in turn provide this container for you. And that's a really, really important part of good grief. Why is it? Well, because you need a place where you can just sort of let go into the pain and the hurt and the suffering of this time and know that somebody's going to be there to catch you. It's knowing that you can enter into that confusion, that liminal space that we talked about last week when things just kind of get turned topsy-turvy and you're not sure about north, south, east, and west, and right and left, and everything is just confusing in your mind and in your heart. And you can no longer think into the future very well because of this loss that you've experienced. And so a community gathers around you and provides a container. As we talk about today, they hold space. The community holds space for you. And because they're holding space for you and because they have a container for you, therefore you can just let go because somebody's going to catch you. If you were all by yourself and if you were all alone and if you still had to buck up and you still had to take care of yourself, if you didn't have a container, if you didn't have anyone standing around you, encircling you with love and watching you, it wouldn't feel safe to let go, because if you let go, it seems like everything would just kind of pour out on the ground. Your heart would just pour out into the sand and dissipate into the air, and you wouldn't exist anymore. But the container provides a safe space for you to let go. The phrase always occurs when we go through these times, and I've been through them, and you've been through them, and you've been with people who've been through them. The thought is always like, I'm afraid to let go. There's a certain kind of resistance that comes up inside. I'm afraid to give in to grief because I'm afraid it's just going to be a bottomless pit. And I'm just going to step off this chasm and I'm going to fall and I'm never going to recover. I'm never going to get out of it. But one of the things that we've learned is actually not letting go is the bottomless pit. If we do not have a safe container where we can express and experience our grief, then grief gets bottled up inside and we become captive to it. We not only become exiles in a foreign land, we become permanent prisoners of a foreign land, no longer able to come back to where we came from. When we don't have a container and we don't have the freedom to sort of express grief to the level that grief demands to be acknowledged and recognized, we bottle it up inside. We store it within our physical bodies, actually, as we talked about a couple weeks ago. We store it within our bodies, and it begins to shape the way our brains work and the way our bodies work. Our hearts get congested with unprocessed sorrow. And we all know people. We're all familiar with people who have experienced great loss and have not been able to process it in a healthy way. Psalm 137 is an interesting illustration of this. Go back to let's do 4 again and start up. Verse 4. Notice the contrast here between how this psalm begins and how it ends. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Now for Jerusalem and Zion, you can substitute whatever it is you lost. Whatever it is, it's a loved one, it's an ability, it's an opportunity, it's a promise, it's a hope, whatever it was that you lost. You hold on to it so tightly and you just think, I can never come back to joy again after that loss. I will never be able to stand in the sun and raise my face and smile again if I forget what I have lost. And then verse 7, there's this interesting turn. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear down its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy are those who repay you according to what you have done for us. So now the turn comes from the experience of their own loss and the feelings of their own grief, and now they're looking for the cause. What's causing me to feel this way? What is the enemy here? Who's doing this to me? And the focus now becomes upon Babylon, who has taken me into exile. Now we know from the prophets and all the stories of the prophets, and we know from 1st and 2nd Chronicles in that tale of how the Babylonian exile took place, that from God's perspective, the reason they were in exile was not because of the evil of the Babylonians, but because of their own sin. It was because of their own promotion of social inequality. It was because of their toleration of vast differences between rich and poor. It was because of their negligence of the practice of Sabbath. It was because of their abuse of the land. All of those things contributed to them going into exile in Babylon so that they could grieve and experience loss, and so that they could come to some kind of awakening that things could have been different. And yet, in Psalm 137, they go from this process and this beautiful phrase of sitting and weeping when we remembered Zion and we remember what we lost, and then they go to focusing on a scapegoat. And the scapegoat is Babylon. And Psalm 137, which starts out with this beautiful Don McLean song from the album American Pie, ends with these horrible words in verse 9, one of the worst verses in the Bible. Happy are those who seize your infants and dash them against the rocks. This is how grief can go wrong. Grief goes wrong in this psalm. It goes from this experience of loss. It goes from this experience of being taken away into a foreign land, and then it doesn't get processed well, it doesn't get contained well, and it begins to focus on a scapegoat, and then it gets turned into vengeance. It gets turned into something that is destructive and something that just perpetuates more loss and perpetuates more grief. Good grief is a way of accepting the loss, of composting it through the process of grief so that it provides the soil out of which good things can grow. Bad grief doesn't process loss well and creates the soil out of which bad things grow. Families that have been divided because grief has not been practiced well. Societies that have been divided and violent conflict that has been perpetuated because grief has not been practiced well. In the United States, the genocide of Native Americans, which has never been acknowledged at a public level, never been acknowledged by the government of the United States. There's never been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about that, which publicly acknowledged, provided a container in which that grief could be expressed, be heard, be integrated into the story that we tell about ourselves. The centuries of slavery, which contributed to the construction of the democratic freedoms that we experience in this country, the numbers of African American men who went off to war in World War I and World War II and fought for this country and then came back to a segregated American apartheid society, all of those things that have never been acknowledged, that have never been recognized, all of those losses that are part of our national psyche, they become unprocessed grief that no one acknowledges, that no one expresses, that there is no container for, there's no place for it to go. And the people who feel the impact of those losses the most often get involved in cycles of violence and cycles of recrimination. So grief happens individually, it happens socially, it happens globally perhaps. With all the environmental destruction that's going on, all the environmental tragedies that are going on, there are people around the world gathering in groups to weep and to pray and to express grief as a community for the ways that we are destroying our planet. They, on behalf of so many of us who don't, are trying to practice good grief in relationship to the destruction of the planet. Psalm 137 gives us this illustration, this warning, that grief is something we need to do well. Grief is something we need to practice well, because when we practice well, it generates renewal, it generates resilience, it practices resurrection, and when we don't practice it well, it results in violence and destruction and the perpetuation of more and more loss. So providing this container where the community comes around, because we can't contain it on our own, the community comes around, and the second thing it does, the community then provides the opportunity for release. Release means both the expression of the grief and of the sorrow, and somebody there to hear it, and somebody there to witness it, somebody there to join with you, perhaps. In John chapter 11, we read about the people who had gathered together to weep along with Mary and Martha. Somebody who feels your pain alongside you. There's the container, and then there's the release. And I'm convinced that there is no loss that we cannot practice good grief with in such a way, not that the loss is ever forgiven, not that the loss is ever healed. The word healed can be a hard word sometimes. It's not healed, but it's expressed, it's contained, it becomes part of the story of the community and of our life together, and it becomes a place where we actually come closer to each other and closer to the reality of the lives that we live. That's why it's so crucial to the health of communities that we practice good grief, along with all the other things that we're called to practice. So one of the ways that we've traditionally done this with grief in terms of containers and release is through the practice of ritual. We have all kinds of rituals around grief, and it's an interesting thing. We talked about it a little bit a couple weeks ago when we talked about how trauma dwells in our bodies, and you can't just talk somebody out of a traumatized place. Mere words don't work for things that have taken up residence within our muscles and within our neurons. Somebody who's suffering PTSD is not going to be talked back to a place of calmness and wholeness. There's a different way that we have to deal with trauma, and there's a different way that we have to deal with loss and deal with grief. And one of the things we do in community is we practice ritual. Ritual is one of the oldest forms of human expression. As far back as we know of human beings around on this planet, we have all kinds of physical evidence that archaeologists have found of different rituals that were practiced. Ritual spaces, ritual tools. We've kind of lost the soft inside, so we don't know the stories, we don't know the words that they use, we don't know the songs that they sang as part of that, but we have all the indicators that something at the very core of a human being and what it means to be a human society is a group of people who do ritual together. Ritual is something that gets us beyond our heads, it gets us beyond our words. It involves our bodies, it involves other people's bodies, and it tries to speak to something that is beyond our own conception. So I fall in love, and I want to tell my young potential mate how much I love her. And so I decide to buy her a rose, and I bring a rose to her. Does she need me to bring a rose to her? Can I just tell her that I love her? Wouldn't that be enough? Well, maybe so. But bringing a rose as a symbolic ritual says something far beyond what my words can say. Far beyond what I, as a limited user of the English language, have the capacity to say. It may even say far more than I want to say. And therefore, ritual has to be careful and thought through. But we all practice these rituals. We all have both micro rituals and macro rituals in which we do things to try to express what words cannot express. In a Jewish funeral, people will gather for Shiva. We talked about this, I think, a few weeks ago as well. The rabbi will go around and they will hang cloth over all the mirrors. This idea that this is not a time for vanity. This is not a time to be thinking about what you look like. This is a time to be focused upon what's going on inside and not the way we appear outside. So it's a lovely, lovely practice. I can remember at the graveside when my brother-in-law passed at a very young age, the practice that we had of everyone coming and throwing dirt into the grave and everyone dropping flowers into the grave. These kind of rituals that become part. Sometimes we have pictures of people now. There's the new ritual of having a slideshow of the person that we've lost, and it will show at the memorial or during the funeral, and we'll have pictures of them through all the stages of their lives so that we can all sort of remember the span of this life and our times together and how much we loved and cared for them. These are rituals that we practice together. These are the containers that we create with each other so that we can have this release of grief that composts our loss and creates an atmosphere for health and for healing. It's been hard to figure out how to integrate this topic with the worship formats that we have received from the Mennonite Church, because they were designed around the lectionary, and we've kind of taken a different tack with the teaching than the lectionary has taken. So last week we did a water ritual because the water ritual was something that we were working with from Mennonite Church and thinking about how to integrate that. And today we're going to work with oil. And I hadn't really thought about oil in relationship to this sermon or this topic. But it seems that one of the practices that oil is used for within Scripture is as a form of anointing for something that is about to happen. So someone who's about to become a king will be anointed at the beginning of their reign, or be anointed at an early stage, like David being anointed by Samuel. There's something about being anointed at the beginning of something that's sort of a sign of God's presence with us. It's also a sign of God's protective presence with us. So we're going to do a little ritual with oil today, and we're going to invite you to come and participate. It's entirely up to you whether you want to or not. With the symbol that this is an oil of presence and an oil of protection. It's a reminder that God is present with us through all the changes and phases of our lives. God is present with us in times of prosperity, and God is present with us in times of loss. God's presence is ever constant and ever faithful. There is never a time when God pulls back. And it's also an anointing of protection. And by protection, it can't mean that we won't experience loss. By protection, it can't mean that we won't be in situations where we feel overwhelmed by grief. By protection, it doesn't mean that we won't sometimes feel lonely and feel abandoned, but protection in the sense that we never are alone and we never are abandoned. And that no matter what life throws at us, no matter what invaders come into our land and take us captive and haul us off to some place and ask us to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land, no matter what, God's presence and God's protection are ever faithful and ever constant and ever true. And that by the work of the Holy Spirit, through the Spirit-empowered community, we can compost every loss, and we can create the soil out of which joy and hope and faith and love can continue to grow among us. We do not want to walk this path alone. We want to walk this path together, not just with God, not just with Jesus. We want to walk this path together with one another. So we anoint with oil as a reminder of God's presence and God's protection and God's faithfulness on this journey of loss that we are all a part of, on this journey of good grief, which we all want to learn how to practice, so that we can all live the abundant lives that Jesus came to offer us. When he said, "I come that you might have life, and that you might have it abundantly." And that includes loss, and that includes grief, and that includes resurrection. That includes God's faithfulness, God's presence, and God's protection. We'll just do one line, and you can come as you feel led. And if you don't feel led, don't come.